Okay, so we still have some folks trickling in, but I think in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and get started. And just, as I'll mention again, if you have any questions that come up throughout this, feel free to include them in the chat. So welcome everybody to the Adaptive Management Planning 101 workshop, the Adaptive Management Forum. Really happy to have you all here. My name is Dylan Chappell, and I am an Adaptive Management Liaison with the Delta Science Program. And right off the top here, I want to acknowledge and thank the Planning Committee for this workshop, which is Karen Kafitz, Kate Spear, and Aaron Cole. So many thanks to everybody's input on this content. I just wanted to take a quick look at the agenda, and before that, just a few housekeeping items. So please mute yourself. Seems like people are automatically joining muted, which is great. And if you haven't already, go ahead and turn off your camera until we head to the breakout groups, and make sure that your team's display name is correct. And if you have questions, you can go ahead and type them into the chat, or if you run into any technical issues, you can contact our support staff at the number below here, the 916 number, or at engage@deltacouncil.ca.gov. And just a heads up, you should be seeing this on your screen, but the first 30 minutes of our workshop today will be recorded. And here's a look at our agenda for the afternoon. We're going to start with an introduction to an overview of adaptive management planning, review the details of our interactive breakout groups, and take any questions about that process. Then from 2 to 3, we'll work in small groups to develop an adaptive management table for an example hypothetical project. At 3, we'll reconvene for a group discussion about the process, and we'll wrap up at 3:30. And for those of you who haven't checked out the mural board for the forum, it's really neat to see what people are putting up there. And I thought that this particular post from this morning was relevant. So I liked whoever posted this, but when I talk to folks about adaptive management, the discussion becomes more reactive, e.g. managing adaptively. I think adaptive management is more proactive, and that it's a structured way to manage uncertainties with a clearer pathway through an adaptive management framework. And that's really what we're hoping to look at today as a group, and to really get you talking to each other about moving some of these ideas forward through a structured framework. And so we'll get into some of those details. So the big goals for today's workshop are to discuss the background of adaptive management planning through the lens of how it relates to the Delta Plan, learn more about available resources to support adaptive management planning, and work in breakout groups to develop an adaptive management table. You should have received an email from me with session details, including the worksheet that we'll use for the breakout groups. The worksheet can also be downloaded using the link that both Karen and I have posted into the chat. So if you click that, it should just start to download automatically. And as we've been hearing about today, adaptive management is a science-based exercise required by a number of regulatory processes. This, of course, is now very famous and will be forever seared in your brain after this week if it wasn't already. 3-phase, 9-step adaptive management process described in appendices C and 1B of the Delta Plan. And specifically, the Delta Plan indicates that adaptive management plans are required for any ecosystem restoration or water management projects in the legal Delta and Sassoon Marsh. And among other things, the plans are required to document access to resources and authority for implementation of the adaptive management process. And as we heard about in many of the talks, and I think particularly in Mike Healy's talk this morning, adaptive management is a best practice for managing complex systems and is required for a number of reasons. So first, it supports the application of best available science. And in this case, the Delta Plan defines best available science by its relevance, inclusiveness, objectivity, transparency, timeliness, and peer review. And building on this best available science allows projects and programs to develop contingency plans for addressing unexpected outcomes. This in turn facilitates the ability of projects to inform future efforts in the system and ultimately take informed action despite the uncertainty inherent in ecosystem management. As Karen discussed in her talk earlier today, there are a few key venues for supporting adaptive management in the system, including the Interagency Adaptive Management Integration Team, or IAMMP, the Sassoon Adaptive Management Advisory Team, or AMAT, and the Delta Science Program Adaptive Management Liaisons, myself and Annika Keeley, who are available to work with projects on early consultations for Delta Plane consistency and other questions related to adaptive management. And our workshop today is partially based on a document called Elements of Adaptive Management and Monitoring Plans, which is a brand new IAMMP product that details potential approaches to adaptive management plan development and includes examples from past projects that have certified as consistent with the Delta Plan. We've been working on this both in our group, in our unit, and in the IAMMP for quite some time now, and we're really excited to be able to make it publicly available. So this and other resources for supporting adaptive management can be found on the IAMMP website. For our breakout groups today, we'll ask you to use the website to identify potential materials for adaptive management planning related to the example project. And again, you can find a link to this site in addition to the worksheet for today in the chat. So don't worry about reading all of this text on these slides right now. You have this in your worksheet. And in a few minutes, we're going to split into breakout groups, each consisting of between about 10 and 15 participants. During this time, each group will select a hypothetical project from these 3 provided problem statements. And for our purposes today, a problem statement is a clear explanation of the problem that a project is designed to address that establishes the background for the project's goals. And these hypothetical problem statements will be used by the group to populate an adaptive management table for this hypothetical project. Now, this table doesn't cover the entire project, but we wanted to focus on it because it really distills some of the key steps of the adaptive management process into one place where a group can really look at the different components that go into it. And so here I'm going to be presenting a simplified example project to guide your work. And again, just really stressing that this is for a hypothetical project, and this is really for illustrative purposes, as are the examples that we're looking at today. So first, in the process of putting together this table, the problem statement is articulated as a series of goals. And in this case, a goal is a broad statement that proposes general solutions to a problem. In this example, the main goal for the project is to increase habitat for juvenile fish. And while most projects have many goals, and in the problem statements we've included a number of potential goals, we ask that each group choose one goal to focus on to begin with. And if you complete the table for the one goal, feel free to address others based on the problem statement or other things that are identified based on the group's expertise. And before I keep moving through this example table, I just want to point out that here in the non-bolded text, you'll have sort of more of a definition, and then the bolded text here will be an example of sort of what we're looking for as far as populating the table. So each goal can have multiple associated objectives. And objectives are quantitative, specific narrative statements of desired outcomes that are designed to allow for evaluation. In this case, the project objectives are to create shaded off-channel habitat to reduce flow velocities and water temperatures compared to the main stem. And this question of goals and objectives, we want to acknowledge that it is defined in different ways depending on what you're looking at. But for the purposes of our activity today, we wanted to really focus on these definitions that are related to the Delta Plan to keep the conversation standardized. So these multiple objectives are then linked to expected outputs, which are on-the-ground implementation and management actions like constructing habitat, and outcomes, which are the desired ecosystem responses to these management actions. In this case, the construction action outputs are expected to produce outcomes, including slowing water flow, reducing water temperatures, and supporting higher juvenile fish density compared to the main channel. Now, we've heard a lot today about evaluation, and how we evaluate in order to move adaptive management forward. So in this case, to evaluate these outputs and outcomes, monitoring categories and monitoring metrics are developed that relate to relevant system parameters. This step generally occurs when actions are being planned and results in measurable metrics. These metrics are organized in categories that relate to outputs and outcomes. We give some examples of categories and metrics here, but there are many potential ways to approach this section. In this case, side channel morphology is given as a physical monitoring category that is related to the output of constructing off-channel habitat. Side channel width is selected as the monitoring metric as it is key to regulating flow velocities. To measure the biotic response to the project actions, juvenile fish abundance compared to the main channel is selected as a biotic metric. Hydrologic conditions are assessed by measuring water temperature and flow compared to the main channel. It's important to note, as we've heard a couple times already today, that baseline data collected pre and post construction are important for contextualizing these monitoring results. And this is something we encourage you to think about as you work with your group to fill out the table. And perhaps the most critical step in the adaptive management process is taking these monitoring metrics and developing trigger levels that determine when alternative management actions will be undertaken. In his talk this morning about the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project, John Bourgeois showed us how triggers are used to manage the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Program at the landscape scale. Here at the project scale, we see this in action on a smaller scale, where if the side channel narrows to 10 feet or less, this will trigger a management action to widen it to at least 20 feet and perform supplemental monitoring. If fish abundance decreases more than 10% from the baseline, this will trigger communication with an advisory team to determine how this trend compares with regional data and develop an appropriate response. If water temperature is consistently measured within 1.5 degrees of the main channel, this will trigger the planting of additional native riparian species to increase shading. Finally, if flow is greater than 90% of the main channel flow, this will trigger the installation of large woody debris to help slow that flow. So this example presents a simplified, heavily simplified look at developing an adaptive management table. And really important to note that all of these quantitative triggers are completely hypothetical. So take them with a grain of salt as far as the specific numbers. And most projects will include numerous monitoring metrics across these general categories. In your group work, we encourage you to draw on your expertise to develop monitoring metrics, trigger levels, and potential management responses in detail. We also encourage you to build on basic information included in the problem statements, again, using your expertise and knowledge and information from some of the from the example adaptive management plan and other resources on the AMMP website. Speaking of, this example that you will find in your packet, in the worksheet rather, is adapted from the Yellow Flyway Farms Wetland Restoration Project Adaptive Management Plan. And this presents a more detailed example from a real-world project. You can find this in your workshop worksheet, and again, examples of other adaptive management plans on the AMMP website. Now that I've mentioned the AMMP website a few times throughout this, we really want you, as part of this group exercise, to get some experience navigating the AMMP website to identify at least one conceptual model from this conceptual model section, at least one monitoring resource from this the monitoring resources tab, and at least one environmental data resource from the environmental data resources tab. And for the conceptual models and monitoring resources, as you click in to those tabs, you'll be able to access that information as a downloadable Excel spreadsheet that is linked in the text. And all of these materials were developed in collaboration with the AMMP to really help provide a place to find information relevant to adaptive management in the Delta and the estuary more broadly. So it's again important to note here that this site is a developing hub for information related to adaptive management. with stress on the developing. And so we also ask you to identify any additional resources that could be included here in the future. And please let us know, let our team know, and we'll be able to add them to what we're making available here. So in addition to these different tabs we're seeing here, there's also example adaptive management plans, as I've mentioned, a checklist for the basic components of an adaptive management plan, as well as resources related to adaptive management from other agencies. Another key part of what we are hoping to have you discuss today that has come up already in the forum quite a bit is that we ask you to discuss how and where information about your project could be communicated. So this could include events like future adaptive management forums, the IAMMP or the AMMP, management conferences like the State of the Estuary, or other potential locations and groups. And a big part of this is that not everybody will necessarily be familiar with all of the different potential venues for communication. So we're really hoping to generate conversation within the group about that particular piece. And this really ties back to the fact that effective adaptive management at this bigger system level that's come up a lot today is really dependent on lessons learned being shared between projects to then inform programs. So in a few minutes, we'll take any questions that people have about this process, and then you'll be randomly divided into breakout groups. To stress Karen's point from before, just sit back once you see that you'll be added to the group. If it gives you an option to click the join button, don't click the join button. There's been some logistical challenges with that. So if you're calling in using your phone line, you will likely remain in the main room. And then I think we've been having some people with previous versions of Teams needing to remain in the main room as well. So that will also be facilitated as a breakout group. So once you're divided up, you're really going to be working together as a group. So everybody can take a few minutes to read through and review the problem statements and select one of these three problem statements to focus on. Then you'll select a scribe to document the group's process using the blank adaptive management table provided in the worksheet. And the scribe will share their screen in Teams, so you need to make sure, double check that your scribe is able to effectively do that before you decide on them. And their job will essentially be to distill the group's feedback into the text. And as I mentioned earlier, you can focus on one goal to start and move to other goals if your group has time. And we really do want this to be as fun and interactive as possible. So please feel free to take some creative license in filling out the table to propose some bold, innovative solutions and have fun with the process. So since these are hypothetical, no idea is too outlandish, and funding is of no concern. So you can really go for some carte blanche ideas here. And as you work through the adaptive management table in your breakout groups, keep these questions in mind. They're also included in your worksheet, so you'll have them there. But these questions that we'll discuss when we reconvene at 3 p.m. Are what are some of the challenges you encountered translating the project to the adaptive management framework? What are possible issues with developing trigger levels and potential management responses? Do you have any suggestions for additional resources that could be added to the web page? And are there any other thoughts, reflections, or questions that you bring based on your experience? But before that, when we divide up into our breakout groups, we do really want you all to take the time to meet each other. We have discussed a lot in this how one of the big benefits of forums and conferences like this is to be able to meet your colleagues. And we really want you all to hopefully meet some new people, learn a little bit about their work, and then see how their experience with their work translates into filling out this example adaptive management plan. So try to keep it to about 30 seconds per person, but you can start by sharing your name, your affiliation, and why you chose to attend this session today. We We'll potentially have representatives in every group depending on the final group size here. So we're aiming for groups of between 10 and 15 that will be randomly divided up. In the event that me, Karen, Aaron Cole, or Kate Spear is not in your group, you can figure out your group structure and sort of self-facilitate these groups. So with that, we want to give the opportunity for anybody to ask any questions before we are divided up into groups. All right, I think Sean's hand up.
Yeah, I just had a quick question on that table. Showing an example at the very you show triggers for management.
Yep.
Or potential management response. Is that response that would be considered being managing adaptively? Because that seems reactive versus proactive, which is what you were trying to point out in the beginning.
Yeah, so that's a great sort of context question, Sean. And I think what we're what we're doing is the idea is providing a structure for future management actions. So in this case, the point of filling this out on the front end is so that if you see a trigger level being reached, you're not coming from a purely reactive place. You're saying, okay, we've thought this through. This is, we proactively thought this through in our planning process. We have a guide, essentially, that's in writing that tells us what we need to do. So, when you're on the ground, of course, doing management interventions, you're always going to be almost like physically reactive. But, and I'm really glad that you brought up this distinction, because a big part of the proactive piece of it is having this plan thought through, vetted, discussed with colleagues before the project is actually implemented to give you that roadmap. Any follow-up to that? Okay, and I think Jeff Miko with your hand up.
Right, so the proactive part is that you've already thought about what you're going to do, and that's going to be widen the side channel to at least 20 feet.
Correct.
If you hit the trigger.
Exactly. And that's, John Bourgeois, and I think we're going to hear more tomorrow from Donna Ball, who is the lead scientist of the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project, for really they're thinking about triggers more at this broader system level. For these purposes, we're looking at it a little more granular. But again, the idea is having a roadmap to allow you to navigate anticipated changes that could throw your project off, and that's the proactive part. Great. So thanks to both of you for those questions. All right. Is there anything else that folks would like to cover before we move on to dividing up into groups? Okay, I think hearing none. So Brandon, I think if we want to start the group process.
Yeah, sure. And I'll just really mention before I start it too that there's only one unmoderated group.
Okay, great. Yeah, and so I guess just before we split up, when you land in your groups, if you can turn on your camera, understand if you're not able to, but if you can turn on your camera, go ahead and turn them on and introduce yourself with your name, affiliation, and why you chose the session. And then you can jump into the process of filling out the table.